Well, Russia's crackdown on opponents of the war in Ukraine has been well documented, but lately the Kremlin has stepped up its efforts to stifle criticism, leading to what some are calling the widest campaign of repression since the Soviet Union. Recent targets have included people like Olesya Krivtsova, a university student who was put under house arrest for anti-war posts on social media. But her luck has just improved.
Out of her shackles and on the run. Olesya Krivtsova gets goosebumps when she thinks back to the moment she freed herself from house arrest and fled from Russia to Europe.
Right before I escaped, I was afraid because stupid thoughts kept coming into my head, like, what if this doesn't work and they arrest me? Would I have to run for miles through the forest?
But she succeeded. Olesya was able to enter the EU, to Lithuania. She knows if her escape attempt had failed, she would likely be in prison by now. Olesya had been waiting under house arrest for the court's verdict. The charges were serious, discrediting the Russian army and justifying terrorism. Her crimes? Handing out anti-war flyers and condemning the war in Ukraine in a private chat with her fellow university students.
That was my protest. I chose the most harmless methods for it. Well, at least that's what I thought. I don't agree with Vladimir Putin's regime, which instigated this war against Ukrainians, who are like brothers to us.
Olesya is one of the almost 20,000 Russians who have been punished for their anti-war stance. The most prominent among them is opposition leader Vladimir Kara-Murza, who strongly criticized Putin and publicly denounced the war in Ukraine. Another Russian was sentenced to 2 years in prison because his daughter drew an anti-war picture. Like Olesya, he also tried to flee Russia, but he was caught and arrested. A careless joke or critical post is all it takes to get a knock on the door from the Secret Service, the FSB, and possibly end up behind bars. The Russian parliament has also tightened a law to make it more difficult for young men to avoid being conscripted. It's made it trickier to leave the country like Olesya did. She believes repression in Russia will get even worse because the Kremlin fears its own citizens.
What if all the young women who were against the war had taken to the streets and gone to the Kremlin? It's clear that people must be intimidated because of this. And that suits the Russian regime very well at the moment.
Olesya's dream is to become a journalist. In another, freer Russia, perhaps that wouldn't have to remain a dream.
Well, earlier, I spoke with Vladimir Ashurkov, a Russian opposition politician who is currently living in London. He's the executive director of the Anti-Corruption Foundation. That's an NGO that was founded by the imprisoned Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. I asked him, is dissent dead in Putin's Russia?
Since the start of this brutal aggression of Russia against Ukraine, a number of repressive laws has been put in place by Russia government that make it very dangerous for people to criticize the war that Russia has unleashed. The protests that happened over the first weeks of invasion have faded out, and now we see ridiculous verdicts, and people can get fines or even jailed for anti-war posts on social media or just for going out to the streets with blank sheets of paper.
Yuri is now in Riga as DW is banned from reporting in Russia. He told us more about how it is easy to be accused of treason or discrediting the army in Russia.
Yes, Sarah. Anyone who publicly shows that he or she disagrees with the policies of Vladimir Putin actually risks being prosecuted by the law. Because most of Putin's policy is his war against Ukraine, and consequently most of the protests are against it. The Russian media have hardly talked about social problems, health problems or economic problems for a long time. Such problems are glossed over. Most of the reporting in Russian media is about the so-called special military operation, and that's what this war is called in Russia, and Russia's alleged enemies in the West. And anyone who doubts the sense of purpose of the war on Ukraine, and does so not only in his mind, in his head, but publicly risks ending up in court, yeah.
How is the crackdown being viewed by analysts, Yuri? I mean, is it being seen as a sign of fear on the part of Putin?
Well, such draconian punishments, and we are talking about thousands of Russians by now, such punishments obviously have one aim, which is intimidation. It's obviously important for the Kremlin to show that anyone can be punished, starting with Kara-Murza, a well-known Russian opposition politician, we saw him in the report, down to a simple young woman somewhere in the northern Russia. Olesya herself gave the answer to your question in my report. If not only she, but all young women in Russia took to the streets, it would be a mass protest, which the Kremlin most likely fear, given that next year Russia votes for a new president and Putin is going to run again.
It's not just the Russian intelligence service spying on people. There have been reports of some people reporting on their friends, on their neighbors. I mean, this is stuff that was seen during the Stalin era. How widespread is this?
Well, I wouldn't speak of a mass phenomenon in this context. According to Russian human rights activists, of the 5,700 cases of prosecution for so-called discrediting of the army, fewer than 200 are based on reports from neighbors and friends. And there are such cases, and these 200 alone are bad enough, but they are not a mass denunciation as in the days of Joseph Stalin. Not yet, because one thing is clear: the more repressive the system is, the more such cases there can be in the future. And the case of Olesya Krivtsova from Petrozavodsk is one of those cases nowadays. Yeah.
Yuri Reshetto, thank you so much.